The wind in the mountains doesn't whisper, it remembers. And on that bone gray morning, as snow crept like a slow ghost across the pine ridges, the wind remembered her name before she even spoke it aloud. Josie Whitlow, 28, born with fire in her bones, but burdened with the silence that followed her from the day her father left with a promise and never returned. She wasn't the kind of woman who cried. She worked. She survived. But nothing in the ranch lands below could prepare her for what waited in the high country. That she had come to the mountains chasing something no map could mark. Her late mother's journal had spoken of a hidden clearing somewhere past Hawks Ridge, where the snow will turn gold in the spring and wild horses gathered like a secret congregation. That place, her mother wrote, was where she found peace once. Josie needed that now more than anything, but peace didn't greet her. Storm clouds built silently over the cliffs as she climbed. Her boots sank into half-frozen mud, and the breath from her lungs came in tight bursts. Her backpack was too heavy, her coat too thin. Still, she pressed on, one stubborn foot in front of the other. By dusk, her compass was useless, spinning wildly, as if it too had given up trying to direct someone so lost. The forest darkened fast. Shadows grew longer than the trees. Josie pitched a small tent by a rock outcrop, her fingers trembling too hard to strike a proper spark. Her match failed 3 times before the fire caught. She huddled beside it, clutching the worn leather journal like a lifeline. On the last page, her mother had written, "The mountain tests before it welcomes, but it never forgets who comes in truth." That night, the wind howled differently. Not through the trees, but deep and low like a warning. Josie should have known then that something watched her. Not man, not storm, but something older than both. By morning, she found tracks around her camp. Too large for any dog, too quiet for a bear. Claw marks etched in the frozen soil curved like they'd been carved with intent. She packed quickly, her gut twisting into knots. She thought of turning back, but pride ran thicker than her sense. She told herself it was just the cold playing tricks, just fear finding shape in shadows. But the mountain doesn't lie. Midday came with sudden warmth, and for a moment, Josie believed she'd imagined the danger. The sun spilled gold through the trees, and she reached the top of the ridge. That's when she saw it, the clearing, just like the journal had promised. A wide expanse of soft grass, dandelions breaking through snow, and far off wild horses grazing, unafraid of her presence. She dropped her bag and walked toward the center, heart thudding, breath catching in awe. She didn't hear the cougar. Not until it was too late. A low growl, a flash of tawny fur, and the weight of the predator slammed her to the ground like thunder. Pain screamed through her arm where its teeth sank deep. She kicked, flailed, rolled, blood soaked her sleeve. She reached for her knife, but it had flown from her grasp. Her body trembled under the force of the beast, claws tearing through her coat. Her scream echoed down the mountain and then silence. But the mountain doesn't just remember suffering. It remembers redemption too. Just as the cougar bared its fangs for the killing blow, a sound split the clearing. Not thunder, hoofbeats, fast and sharp like were drums. A horse reared behind her, and a shadow moved quicker than her eyes could follow. The cougar shrieked and leapt away into the woods. Josie barely saw the figure that dismounted, a tall man wrapped in deer hide, feathers braided into jet black hair, and eyes darker than dusk. She fell unconscious before his hands even reached her. The mountain watched, and the wind stilled. Redemption had arrived on horseback, with a name long whispered through bloodlines older than the country itself. Snow returned the next day, soft and vengeful, covering Josie Whitlow's blood trail like the mountain wanted to erase her pain. But she wasn't dead. No, something, or rather someone, had decided her story wasn't meant to end beneath the cougar's breath. When she awoke, it wasn't to the sound of birds or firewood crackling. It was silence, thick and almost sacred. Josie's eyelids fluttered open inside a dimly lit cabin that smelled of pine tar, animal hide, and smoke. Her shoulder throbbed, freshly bandaged with herbs tucked beneath cloth. She didn't know where she was or who had saved her, but the way the room was kept said enough. This was not the home of a stranger. It was the home of someone who belonged deeply to this land. High above her, the wooden beams bore etchings through symbols she would later learn for strength, honor, protection. A woven blanket was tucked under her chin. On the wall hung a curved hunting bow, and beside her on a carved stool rested a steaming bowl of soup that smelled like smoked rabbit and wild herbs. She tried to rise, but her body refused, so she watched the shadows dance across the ceiling and wondered why she had been spared. By the time her rescuer returned, the fire had died low. He entered without sound, tall and deliberate, his presence quiet but powerful. He wasn't old, but something in his expression carried generations. His hair was long, tied behind him, and his clothes were stitched from animal hide, yet his boots were laced with gold-threaded leather. It was a strange contrast, tradition woven with wealth. He checked her bandage and replaced the herbs without a word. When she tried to speak, he raised a single hand, not to silence her, but to assure her that rest was the only answer for now. She read something in his eyes, grief, maybe, or burden. He wasn't just a mountain man. This was someone who knew loss. And yet, he'd still risked his life to save hers. Days passed. She healed slowly, spoon-fed by the man she barely knew. In silence, she observed he carved wood with care. He tended to 2 horses. He prayed before eating. He carried a rifle, but it remained untouched by the door, as if he only kept it out of obligation, not desire. Then one morning, the silence broke not with words, but with a gesture. He laid a folded newspaper at her bedside. Its headline read, "Heir to Red Earth Mining returns to ancestral land." Josie blinked. Red Earth Mining. That name had once painted the walls of every dusty saloon across the West. The company had found silver, gold, and coal across tribal lands, only this heir had disappeared from the public eye after a lawsuit 10 years ago. The man in front of her wasn't just a recluse. He was the richest Sioux descendant in the territory and the only one who walked away from profit in favor of principle. His name was Wikia, Thunder Spirit. He had left the city behind, built the cabin himself, and returned to the land not just to escape but to rebuild what had been taken from his people. And now he had saved a stranger who had no business being in the mountain. A white woman, alone, injured, and with no explanation beyond the faded journal she kept tucked inside her coat. That night, as the moon spilled silver across the cabin floor, Josie whispered into the darkness, not to him, but to herself. Why? Why had he saved her? The next morning, her answer came in the form of a worn satchel he placed in her lap. Inside, it was a stone, a smooth, round rock with etchings nearly identical to those carved above her bed. She blinked. It was the same stone her mother had once sketched in her journal. The stone her mother claimed was gifted to her after saving a child from a fever near Hawksridge years ago. A child with cold dark eyes and a name the village elders whispered. Josie looked up. He hadn't saved her by chance. He had known. Her mother and the mountain, it seemed, wasn't done with either of them. The fire inside the cabin crackled low, yet Josie's world was ablaze with revelations. She hadn't come to the mountain just chasing peace. She had been drawn by blood. Her mother's journal hadn't just been a map to healing. It had been a trail of debts, of kindness owed, and memories buried. And the man now watching her stir soup with a healing hand wasn't just Wikia, a mountain recluse with Sioux nobility. He was the boy her mother had once rescued, healed, and sent back into a world that didn't deserve him. Wikia hadn't said a word, but Josie had begun to hear him anyway through the way he moved, the way he let her stay without question, the way he listened to the wind like it still whispered names only his ancestors knew. That day, as snow melted into slush outside, Josie asked for the journal. Her voice was hoarse, her wounds raw, but the mountain didn't need perfect voices. It only needed truth. She turned to a page her mother had marked with pressed cedar leaves. There it was, a story of a child found fevered near a broken creek. Dead, his family gone, his breath shallow. Her mother had carried him for miles in the dead of winter, lit a fire in a hollow cave, and refused to let him die. She had written, "He looked at me like I was a star fallen too soon." And I knew I was supposed to find him. Now Josie understood. She wasn't just chasing a dream. She was answering a call left unanswered for decades. That night, while Wakia sat outside with his horses, Josie walked through the cabin, following the carvings. Each symbol told a story. One of them, a jagged spiral beneath a hawk's wing, matched the one on the stone her mother had passed to her. She traced it with trembling fingers. She didn't notice Wakia behind her until she turned. He said nothing, but in his eyes she saw it. Recognition, not of her face but of her spirit. The following day, he took her higher into the mountain. Not far, just enough for her to see a hidden glade covered in frost moss and broken birch stumps. Beneath one, a half-buried wooden marker leaned forward, worn and forgotten. Josie knelt beside it and brushed off the snow. Her mother's name wasn't carved on it, but the initials M.W. and a carved hawk told her what words could not. Her mother had once returned to this mountain and left a part of herself behind. As they rode back down the path in silence, Josie saw more clearly than she ever had in her life. The mountain was more than a place, it was a keeper of stories, of debts and redemptions passed through blood and spirit. Her mother had saved a child, and now that child had grown into a man who saved her. But fate doesn't deliver peace without testing it first. Up by the time they reached the cabin, something had changed. Smoke curled from the chimney, but neither of them had lit a fire. Josie froze. Wakia drew his knife. Inside, 3 men waited, strangers. They wore city boots that didn't belong on mountain ground and smelled like gun oil and cheap bourbon. On the table lay Josie's journal, open, violated. One of the men laughed when Wakia stepped in, but that laughter turned to stillness as the Sioux raised his blade, not with rage, but with warning. They knew who he was. They weren't thieves. They were from Red Earth Mining, men who didn't believe Wakia had truly walked away from the Empire. Men who wanted land rights hidden beneath these ridges, land that Josie's journal might have hinted at, a secret cave her mother once drew, a mineral vein untouched and undocumented. Wakia didn't speak. He didn't need to. The storm and his stare told them enough. The men backed down that day. But the war had begun. They would return, and this time they wouldn't just want land. They would come for everything the mountain had protected: heritage, blood, and the fragile beginning of something Josie couldn't name yet, something worth defending. The cabin no longer felt like sanctuary. It felt like a ticking clock. After the men from Red Earth Mining left, their shadows lingered longer than their boots. The smell of cigar smoke clung to the walls like rot, and Josie could feel it every time she breathed. Wakia didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Josie had seen it in the way he cleaned his rifle that evening, not like a man preparing for violence, but like a man writing a legacy. A protector, not just of land, of memory. That night Josie found herself standing outside beneath the stars, the cold cutting through her coat. Above her, constellations sprawled across the sky like the stories her mother once told. Stories of rivers that remembered, mountains that forgave, and winds that carried whispers of justice. She hadn't believed them then, but here, now, under this sky with danger looming, she knew those stories had been warnings. Red Earth Mining wasn't finished. They wanted a resource her mother had once stumbled upon by accident. The hidden mineral deposit beneath Hawk's Ridge, the one she'd kept secret all her life. She hadn't written about it openly, but her drawings, her metaphors, they were enough for someone greedy to trace, and now they believed Josie held the key. Wakia spent the next 2 days in silence, preparing the land. He walked the ridge lines, marked the soft soil, and checked the perimeters, not with fear but with familiarity. This wasn't the first time he'd had to defend sacred ground. When he returned each evening, Josie noticed his hands. They weren't the hands of a man who had spent his life in gold-trimmed boots or boardroom meetings. These were the hands of someone who had tilled soil, buried kin, carved canoes. A man who had once been a boy coughing blood beneath her mother's shawl. They shared meals in silence, but silence had become a kind of language between them. Every glance carried weight. Every gesture was a sentence. When he placed her mother's stone beside her soup bowl, she understood. It wasn't a gift. It was a reminder that she had been brought here not just by memory but by purpose. And then the storm came. It wasn't snow or wind. It was the black growl of engines at dawn. Josie woke to the sound of tires digging into frozen earth. 5 men, guns, shovels, a smirk on one of their faces she recognized from old courtroom photographs. One of Red Earth's former legal hounds, now turned mercenary land scout. They weren't asking this time. They were taking. Josie stepped outside, her coat barely fastened, boots half-laced, but her voice steady. They told her to hand over the journal. She said nothing. Wakia stood behind her, arms crossed, a rifle over one shoulder. No words, just silence again. The kind that made grown men remember their mothers. But these weren't men who feared spirits or ancestors. They had law in their back pocket and greed in their eyes. That night, they returned with papers, forged titles, counterfeit deeds, and a promise to the county court that this land was unclaimed. Josie stood by Wakia's side as he held the papers to the fire and let them burn one by one. That's when the threats began. You'll wish the cougar finished her. They thought she would run. That a city-born woman who came here chasing. Ghosts wouldn't fight for ground she barely knew. But Josie had tasted what her mother called the pulse of the land. And she knew now this mountain wasn't just land. It was memory, blood, and breath. Her mother had died keeping it secret. And Josie would not let it be stolen. As the stars returned that night, she picked up the rifle for the first time. Her hands shook, but her eyes did not. The morning came heavy with frost, but fire burned beneath the surface. Not in the trees or the hearth, but in Josie Whitlow's chest. She no longer felt like a stranger in the mountains. Not after the men returned for the third time this time with rifles flung low and maps they claimed were official. Not after they scoured the ridge behind the cabin and spray-painted a red X over the very ground her mother once wrote about as hallowed earth. Wakia didn't sleep that night. Neither did Josie. They sat in the cabin, oil lamp flickering, the air thick with decisions too heavy to name. There was no cavalry coming, no legal team, no judge to listen. Justice wouldn't come in a robe. It would come in silence, smoke, and memory. By dawn, Wakia saddled both horses. He strapped a leather pouch around Josie's waist. Inside it, the stone her mother had left behind and the journal, wrapped in oilskin. He gave her a glance that said what words could not. Be ready. They followed the ridge trail that led to the old cave her mother once described. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and the pine needles glittered like glass. Josie didn't ask where they were going. She knew. They were taking the fight to the mountain, not with bullets, but with truth. The cave mouth was narrow, half covered by frost and overgrowth. Inside, Wakia lit a torch. Josie followed him through twisting stone halls until they reached it. A chamber the size of a church, where sunlight filtered in through cracks above. And in the center, veins of glinting rock split the ground like roots made of silver and fire. This was it, the untouched vein. The treasure the mining men hungered for. Josie stepped forward and dropped her mother's journal on the stone floor. She traced the same markings from the cave walls inside its pages. This was the proof, but it wasn't going to be used for profit. It was going to be their shield. As they left the cave, Wakia didn't hide his trail. He wanted them to follow, and they did that. By sunset. 3 men stormed the cabin. Josie had already gone. Wakia stood at the door alone, unarmed. He let them ransack the place, let them shout and threaten. Then he handed them a copy of the journal. Redacted, incomplete, just enough to lure them into arrogance. They didn't see the news closing. The next morning, Josie walked straight into the county courthouse to towns down. Her wounds still fresh, coat still torn. She carried her real copy of the journal. She requested a public hearing and filed a protective claim on behalf of the Sioux Nation. Wakia's name was listed as the legal descendant of the last land steward. A long-forgotten treaty buried beneath decades of false deeds and oil stain. Hands gave him rights they never saw coming, and Josie. She gave the press what they hungered for, a story. About a woman nearly killed by nature, saved by a man abandoned by history, and land stained not just with gold but with memory. Within days, it went viral. Articles flooded the territory. Headlines like, mining giant stopped by woman with a wound and a journal, or Sioux heir breaks silence on ancestral land grab. But Josie didn't read them, neither did Wakia. They just watched as the men in boots returned one last time, not with guns, but with silence. They left, just like the cougar. Once they knew this place had teeth. That night, the cabin fire burned. Higher than it had in weeks, Josie stood outside alone, eyes fixed on the stars. She wasn't just a woman passing through anymore. She was her mother's daughter, the keeper of a promise, the bearer of a mountain's memory. Behind her, Wakia stepped forward not as a rescuer, but as someone finally unburdened. They didn't speak, but something passed between them. Not love. Not yet, but something older. A shared truth. That redemption doesn't shout. It waits. Spring crept slowly into the highlands that year. The thaw was quieter than usual, like the mountain itself held its breath, listening to a story it had waited too long to finish. Ice receded from the ridges, revealing trails once lost, and wildflowers bloomed like soft confessions across the valley. The danger was gone, but the echoes remained of greed, of wounds, and of choices that changed everything. Josie Whitlow stayed. She didn't go back to the city, or the broken life she barely held together before chasing the ghosts of her mother. She chose the cabin not because it was safe, but because it was sacred. Wakia didn't ask her to stay. He simply built a second saddle rack, a stronger front gate, and carved her initials beside his into the porch beam. The land was officially protected now. A legal wall of fire surrounded it, treaty clauses, mineral rights retracted, survey lines drawn with integrity for the first time in over a century. The men from Red Earth Mining never came back. But their absence wasn't victory. It was surrender. The kind that comes when something wild refuses to be tamed. Josie spent her days walking the high trails with a journal in her coat pocket and a hunting knife at her hip, not to fight, but to remember. She studied plants, replanted wild herbs. Her mother once described and learned stories Wakia shared not through words, but through rhythm. The beating of a high drum in the evenings, the slow carving of totems by Firelight. Their relationship didn't unfold like a novel. There were no grand confessions, just the slow weaving of two lives that had lost too much not to understand each other. They cooked, they repaired fences, they read under stars. And when Josie laughed for the first time in what felt like years, it was while watching Wakia try to herd a stubborn goat she rescued from a nearby ridge. But the mountain had one last gift. Late one night, as lightning whispered across the horizon and the air grew heavy with that rare, sacred kind of silence, Josie walked back to the clearing where it all began, where the cougar nearly ended her. Where the horses once stood, the grass had grown tall again. The scar on her shoulder throbbed softly, not in pain, but in memory. She knelt and placed her mother's stone back into the earth, not buried. Returned. From behind her, Wakia approached with a lantern. He didn't speak. He simply stood beside her and looked out into the dark. And then it came, the softest wind, like a breath across time. It carried her mother's scent, smoke, cedar, rain on cotton. It carried her name, not shouted, not spoken. Whispered. Josie. She stood slowly, and in that moment, everything her mother had written finally made sense. The mountain doesn't forget. It tests. It teaches. And if you come in truth, it redeems. As they walked back to the cabin together, the lantern swung between them like a heartbeat. The cougar never returned, but its eyes lived on in Josie, sharp, aware, and afraid. The fire inside her no longer burned in silence. It warmed the cold places, lit the forgotten paths, protected what mattered. By summer, they opened a one-room schoolhouse near the ridge. taught local children the real history of the land tribes, treaties, survival, and spirit. Wakia carved benches from pine. Josie painted the walls with the colors her mother once described. Word spread, people came. Not just tourists but elders, historians, even city folk who once overlooked the names carved into the dirt. One reporter wrote, "Redemption lives on Hawks Ridge now. Not as a monument, but as a woman with a scar and a man who never forgot." And beneath that headline, a photograph Josie and Wakia standing under the old cedar, eyes quiet, hands clasped over the stone neither of them owned, but both of them belonged to. Because frontier redemption doesn't arrive on horseback anymore. It waits in the mountains. In silence until you earn it.